Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon here in California. We're very pleased to be able to share our work on assessment with you. Here is a group of third-year students, and we're also very lucky to have Dr. Craig Chacquist, who is our Associate Provost with us, and our Provost, Dr. Joe Cambray. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint with you and alternating when the students also present and our administrators. We used an appreciative inquiry model developed by Watkins and Moore, in which we start by appreciating the contents of our curriculum and linking them with program learning outcomes that we consider our dreams for the future. These learning outcomes help us to design the assessment approach that we keep to sustain over the years. In the self-study, several stakeholders were involved, all of those who are affected by this work, such as the fieldwork advisors and the fieldwork coordinator, program faculty, students, alumni, our administrators who are here with us, and the communities we are accountable to. Each of them will present themselves when they present their reflections. This assessment approach was also included in our yearly program reviews and in a now 8-year-long self-study since the beginning of our specialization in 2010. Our curriculum pursues to foster competencies in diverse areas, and this is an ambitious framework that requires that we constantly articulate our pedagogical values and goals. In the most recent last 2 or 3 years, we have been including guidelines developed by our students who are involved in racial justice work in 2 groups, the Racial Allies group and the Student of Color group. We will be continuing to revise the competencies, including the guidelines. We develop our rubric, including the guiding principles of the SCRA, in 18 practice competencies developed by the SCRA Educational Practice Council, and added pertinent competencies in the other fields of our specialization. The fieldwork advisors were involved in core faculty co-constructing the items in the rubric, and we engage students who finished their fieldwork 1 in the first year of their summer program, and fieldwork 2 together with the advisors who evaluate their fieldwork reports as well as the experience during the advising time. They also are engaged in 2 classes where they present their fieldwork. They use the rubric to provide peer-based feedback, and in the 3rd year, in participatory action research class, the students who are present were engaged in different approaches of the application of the rubric and this assessment. And they will be reporting this directly.
So good afternoon, good people. My name is Shane Castroni, and as Nuria has mentioned, I'm a 3rd-year CLE student here at Pacifica. And as she's mentioned already, this first slide showcases our development of practice competencies as they've developed from the 1st year into the 2nd year, so F1 into F2. And generally speaking, this rubric shows slight increases in the ranking means, indicating perceived practice competencies mastery above experience towards expert rank. So from about 2.5 to moving towards that expert rank. In my own experience, the interdependence of these foundational skills are felt in my work on a daily. As of late, I'm working with my intertribal community to co-create a community-based organization named Alma Rose, which is set with the mission of holding space for community regeneration. So if we just hold for a moment with that word regeneration, we view it as wholly interdependent. Our vision is one of social, economic, and environmental balance, which is aimed at improving the quality of life for our local community. Just south of campus, about 30 minutes away in the city of Oxnard. So At Alamo Rose, we employ a multi-level perspective. So that's if we look at number one, ecological perspective, we believe once again in interdependence, and that's expressed in our cultural understanding carried by our intertribal community that's summed up in the Lakota prayer of Matakwiyasans, for all my relations. So our interventions are aimed at putting an end to the poisoning of our lands, bodies, and future. And so in working towards this, we really seek to center the voices of our community, and we value a participatory approach. And so we are focused on number two, empowerment rather than social engineering. Our community knows what's wrong with what's going on in the community, and we also have the skills, talents, and abilities to heal ourselves. So that's all encompassed in that word regeneration. If we have a safe container to do it, and that's what Alamo Rose is. And this really did arise out of praxis from the theories that were presented in the CLE program. So again, Alamo Rose is an extension of the intertribal community and the work in CLE. And so again, our programming at Alamo Rose is employing an indigenous ontological and epistemological knowing. So that leads us to number three, socio-cultural competencies. It's an indigenization of praxis, and it can be viewed as a movement beyond the narrow scope of Euro-Western imperialism and hegemony that's really, for the last 500 years, have really just wounded our relationships with one another and with the planet, which we depend upon. So again, regeneration, it's for us and by us. We can heal ourselves if we have the space to do it. But again, it boils down to number four, community inclusion and partnership. We're developing coalitions on a daily, and we're really trying to bring in as much community as we can to heal these wounds that we have as we advance well-being, which brings us down to health promotion. And to reach that point, we're developing programming. I'm managing the project on the constant, going down to number 8, mentoring and leading the project. And again, this is not just for humans, this is for all of our relations. So we're keeping that in mind as we move forward. Beyond that, like in my own practice, and if we shift back to the larger dialogue of the advances that we've made over the last 2 years within our cohort, I'd say that we've seen some dramatic increases, more specifically when it relates to public policy analysis and development and advocacy. I know that personally I'm working on efforts regarding pesticide use in my community. I'm starting to work within that domain. And then number 18 is participatory community research and program evaluation. Those are other 2 domains that are seeing large increases for our cohorts as we evolve from the first to the second year. So these increases may be due to application in fieldwork 2, or it could be due to improved classes. But I'd also like to think that it's about application in life. So in just kind of concluding on this first slide, recommendations are to increase these competencies in curriculum review, while providing more opportunities for community practice in between fieldwork. And I know that I'd love for Alamo Rose to be a place where the students could practice these competencies in between fieldwork. But now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Tara, who's going to talk more about the depth psychological competencies.
Hi, my name is Tara Apperly, and I'm a 3rd year in this program. And I'm talking about depth psychological practice competencies. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with depth psychology as a discipline, the term was coined at the turn of the 20th century by a Zurich-based professor of psychiatry who oversaw the institution where Carl Jung began his career as a psychiatrist. And so depth psychology as a term has become widely used by Freudians, Jungians, and other psychologists to indicate those psychologies that orient around the idea of the unconscious. And so this work in depth psychology arises largely from the psychoanalytical tradition, but in the contemporary world, this idea of depth has really expanded to include studies of any processes which operate outside of the conscious awareness. And so for this reason, primarily, depth psychology becomes very complementary with indigenous psychologies or indigenous approaches to the psyche, particularly because of that emphasis on the unconscious and the deeper dimensions of the functionings of human psyche. And so depth psychology also places a great value and significance on dreams, metaphors, images, symbols, silences, gaps, the said and the unsaid. There's also an emphasis on polyphony in regards to learning to listen into the voices of that which has been marginalized traditionally, and not only listening to human voices, but listening to voices in a more abstract sense in terms of many dimensions of psyche or complexes that may manifest as symptoms. And so our treatment of what in traditional psychology would be called disorders, we find it valuable to learn how to listen into those symptoms, how to suspend or bracket our judgments or our understandings, our perceived understandings, so that we can allow for that which is unconscious to arise and to present itself. So in many ways, depth psychology, although rooted in psychology as a discipline, really overlaps greatly with many aspects of phenomenology in terms of, again, that idea of polyphony. And so that explains the various skill sets that are presented in these competencies. And what we find is that these skill sets allow for a reorientation from a very westernized, objectivist, positivist paradigm that allows us to consider something beyond all of that. And what we're seeing from the data is that from fieldwork 1 to fieldwork 2, students across the board are showing a movement from exposure, expertise, and moving greatly towards expertise. And that is evidenced primarily in the findings of numbers 27, 30, and 33. And if you look at the content of those categories, again, these skill sets tend to be very relational. So 27 is, again, looking at how students learn how to adapt a stance of multi-partiality so that we can host those divergent thoughts or perspectives that otherwise might be silenced or marginalized. When we look at number 30, the capacity to listen to symptoms in a person, group, or system and to understand them as attempts at communication of that which might have been denied a space. And so in that sense, we're dealing with issues of shadow that within a traditional paradigm of psychology might be marginalized or pathologized. And we're really creating that room for that which is seeking to express itself to emerge and for us to learn how to engage with that. And with that said, also, depth psychology really allows for a great integration of the arts because of our valuing of images and non-traditional forms of communication. And so just to summarize all of this, overall, depth psychology is the core of our degree. And so we see that students have a greater sense of expertise in this, and we wonder if that is perhaps because of the type of students that Pacifica tends to attract, students who are already seeking or oriented towards more diverse ways of being than might be offered in a mainstream psychology program. And what we also see is that depth psychology, although rooted in the discipline of psychology, offers enough inclusion so that there are many intersections with the other areas of our specialization, looking at community liberation psychology, eco and indigenous psychologies. And so these skill sets in depth psychology are helping us to learn how to relate to each other, to our world, to the non-human world in more humane and relational ways.
So my name is Tessa, or Teresa Clearman, and I'm a third-year student in the CLE program. My focus has been on eco-psychology. For anyone who's unfamiliar with what that field is about, it's a study of the relationship between human beings and the natural world through ecological and psychological principles. We work toward developing and understanding the emotional connection between individuals and nature. And one of the goals is to remedy alienation that happens between humans and the natural world. This is a relatively young field of study. If you can see from the slide, there are fewer competencies listed in this rubric, but they are still very important. And you can also see that over the past 2 years, there has been an increase in every area except for one, which is number 37. Speaks to the care to pay attention to the history of a particular place under consideration, both natural and cultural. We had an increase in that area from 2.5 to 2.8. Area 39, there's an openness to experiencing and engaging intellectually, emotionally, practically, spiritually with joy and pain of humans, other sentient beings, and the rest of nature at this particular moment in evolutionary history. This is particularly of importance with so much discussion about global warming, environmental policy, sixth extinctions, this type of thing. In this rubric, we went from 2.25 to 2.27. Another significant one was number 41, which was understanding the role and characteristics of our species in the evolving story of life on this planet and in the cosmos. This one increased dramatically from 1.9 to 2.6. My summer field work in particular focused on the impact on wildlife during early colonization of North America. I was specifically looking at predators that were destroyed during colonization and the question of existence and how that plays out in the human psyche if something isn't documented as having been existing here before us. Does it exist?
My name is Carl Chavez, and I'm also a third year here at Pacifica Graduate Institute with the CLE program. What we're looking right now is at the frequency of practice competency slide based on the reflection essays. What we see is a table that's depicting from left to right the frequency rank, the practices competency domains, and the frequency as far as the number of times these were cited. What we can see here is how the top ranks are number 1 and 2, which are the depth psychological practice competencies and the foundation principles. One of the things that we attributed to these being ranked the highest is how we engage frequently in the language. And we are constantly in this program exploring the underlying components of paradigms and how they affect our relationality and in turn how they affect our community and our understanding of it. The lower one, the ones that were ranked lower, social, cultural, and cross-cultural competencies, eco-psychological competencies, community research, community and organizational capacity building, community and program development. We reflected on them, and one of the things that we came up, we discussed was that while we are engaging in the language, the actual practice of it, we tend to reduce it only to the 2 events of fieldwork. What we don't often become aware or actually engage in dialogue is that we are implementing a lot of the practices on our day-to-day life in different ways. The other component of it too is that the more clear or better understanding that we have of critical consciousness, the more that we see the way in which the systemic and institutional paradigms molds us, and we become more self-critical as far as being able to call ourselves specialists in diversity. However, that itself is something that is able to help us see things differently because we know that things are not universal. So this is pretty much a way in which we reflect our understanding of how the teachings of the CLE program have given us a better understanding to these domains.
Yeah, if I could just add too, with 5 through 7, I feel like, yeah, beyond not having, like, finding more opportunities for practice, also structural barriers with doing our community research and doing capacity building and program development. We need more opportunities to express like what depth psychologists are capable of doing, and also we're butting up against like structural challenges as well with us being able to implement our work. So I think there's just an important point to point that out, and that's kind of a hindrance that plagues us in our field.
Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Kincaid. I'm also a third-year student. My work is focused on the intersection of counter-trafficking initiatives and the sustainability development goals. So in the context of the CLE program, it's where community psychology and eco-psychology interact. So following on from what Carl presented, this slide shows part 1 of a 2-part coding process in this participatory qualitative research exercise, where in vivo coding was used to evaluate core practice competencies that were established, as Nuri said earlier, by Pacifica Graduate Institute CLE program and SCRA. So initially, we evaluated self-reflective essays based on our fieldwork and praxis leading to dissertation work to identify key aspects of our experience as it relates to the core competencies. So the in vivo coding process enabled us to use exact words and phrases to connect to the category rubric which was provided. The overall findings for 2 academic years of data revealed emerging patterns for the 2 participating cohorts as shown in this table in years 2016 to 2018. So as shown, the greatest frequencies are listed at the top of the table to the least frequency at the bottom. And the identified trend showed depth psychological core competencies were highest, followed by foundational principles, with other practice competencies less frequent. Year after year, there's been a reflective process and adjustments made in the curricula to balance the theoretical and practical components of the program. So this exercise provided valuable information as to what core components of the CLE program need to be made more robust, as well as stimulated discussion around how data is captured, analyzed, and then presented. So one recommendation following this particular exercise with self-reflective essays was that the data may be heavily weighted to depth psychological competencies, as this particular category heading lists many more items under than the rest of them. So one recommendation that I'm making is to review and assess the items under each category heading and then allocate the same number under each. On the next slide, I'm going to speak briefly and then turn it over to Tess to the exercise, this similar exercise with semi-structured external interviews of alumni and current students in the dissertation process, utilizing the same in vivo coding process. So as shown here, similar findings resulted from the analysis of these external interviews, where foundational principles and then depth psychological competencies were the most frequently reported. Like with the self-reflective essays, here we used the in vivo coding and then mapped it back to that category rubric which was provided. So one category which wasn't captured in the rubric but came forth in the external interviews I conducted, as well as in my own self-reflection based on fieldwork in Nepal, was indigenous psychologies. So indigenous psychologies could very well be placed, and this is something that Tara spoke to as well, under the main category heading of depth psychological core competencies. It could also be placed under eco-psychological competencies. However, this particular category, indigenous psychologies, really stands to be recognized as its own category. So it's important to note the intersectionality of some of the practice competencies and also where they stand on their own for measurement purposes. So it's recognized that this is a generative process. An additional recommendation is to annually review and then assess the category headings and category items captured and then revise based on the data provided.
So one of the greatest challenges in this field is evaluating data and disseminating it in a way that translates in a scholarly and academic fashion. The method that we used to gather the data again was this interviewing process with students that were in their dissertation phase of their PhD. The questions were geared around this rubric, and then transcribed interviews were evaluated. We were looking for similarity, difference, frequency, sequence or order, correspondence or relation to other activities, causation. The first process, as Sam already pointed out, was this in vivo coding, which refers to looking for words or phrases in the data that are relevant to the competencies. First cycle coding is then placing those codes into themes, and then or pattern coding, putting them in sets or constructs. And then the second cycle coding was converting the data into numeric codes. And finally, we looked at the frequencies in order to evaluate student competencies in each domain. Something that I found that was very interesting was turning the rubric over to the student before the interview and having them self-evaluate, and then taking that data and comparing it to the data that we gathered after the interview process.
So this slide shows the frequencies of practice competencies domain reported in the narrative analysis of newsletters. So in addition to the various ways in which we looked at this data, we also looked into the various narratives that students have provided in the newsletters in order to note the frequencies of these practice competencies. And what we found over a period of 4 years is that with each year, the number of frequencies reported increased. And we imagine that that could simply be because we have been in this process of this type of participatory research, and that we have learned quite a bit about how to increase practice competencies with each passing year. And we think that this might be reflected in what students are reporting in narrative form. And then this slide shows testimonies, newsletters, e-portfolio, and interview links that you can click on to learn more about what those narratives and various interviews look like.
Yeah, and I know that personally speaking, those narratives were so helpful in developing my own sense of agency of what I could accomplish by building off of the work of our previous cohorts and seeing all the great work that they're doing and that they have done. And it was really empowering to read those stories and narratives, to see the possibilities of what we can imagine in this program. So I just want to highlight that, how it definitely empowered me, and again, like added to my sense of agency of what was possible. Yeah.
We have here with us the fortune to have our two highest administrators, the president of Pacifica Graduate Institute, Dr. Joe Cambray, and our associate provost, Dr. Craig Chapwist, who will also share with us what this work has meant for them and for the Institute. Thank you.
Sure. I'll be brief and just say that I appreciate this work so much that as the assessment liaison officer for this school, when I write the reports to our accreditors, I actually draw on this work done in CLE as an exemplar of how to combine assessment and social justice work and academic work and good scholarship. So.
And in terms of the overall directions that Pacifica is taking in its future roles, this feels to me like an essential component. One of the questions we have here across the board, not only in CLE, but through all of our programs, is what is the changing face of depth psychology in the 21st century? What is that going to look like? And it's clear that depth psychologies were focused originally on intracyclically on the internal world of individuals, and gradually became more relational about the dyadic process, But really what's needed is a multicultural approach, and that is something yet to be achieved. So these kinds of research projects and helping us see where the underlying areas that need greater focus and emphasis are extremely important for guiding us towards the future. I mean, I'm starting to look at things like multiple evidence-based approaches so that we can begin to get out of some of the constraints of some of the medicalized formulations of things like depth psychology. And so we see this as also as a program that is really launching some very key research efforts. And that's one of the other directions that we hope to take the institution in the next 3 to 5 years, is to develop a research center to begin to have more and more possibilities for our graduate students to be able to have research associateships and so forth. And so it's these kind of programs that give us the kind of foundational work to step forward in those directions. So I'm very proud and very impressed by what I've witnessed.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. Well, we hope to expand and continue to work on all the recommendations that we are given by our students and administrators. Every year, at the end of every quarter, actually, we gather recommendations at the end of the quarter, and every year we look at curriculum review, trying to integrate them. We have an article published in the Global Journal of Community Psychology Practice that you can also review for more information. And now we invite you all to have some dialogue with us and have some questions here that I hope. Let's see, wait a second.
I think you can go to the red at the top, stop share.
But I wanted to present the questions.
Oh.
I don't know why just.
You get to edit.
So we have here some questions for you to help us answer, and we will happy to also receive questions from you. Thank you very much. Stop sharing. Is it here? Stop sharing.
Orange one. The orange one.
The red. There you go.
Can you see that? Yeah. No, I have my glasses. Okay. Jill?
Hello. Thanks, guys.